Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Resistance United Great Britain again. Tonight we have the great William Gairdner, and he is going to speak about his amazing book, The War Against the Family. He's going to discuss the fourth chapter, which is the anti-family tradition. I think it's probably one of the best episodes in the book. And as usual, we are very thankful to you for your time and knowledge and kindness. And the floor is yours. Please take us away.
Thank you very much again for having me.
Our pleasure.
Last time we spoke about the family tradition in the West. And I'm just sharing with you my recall of writing these various chapters. When I wrote the chapter on the family tradition, I hadn't really been able to find much in defense of it. I found lots of studies and books and essays, and there's a gazillion of them, but nowhere where it was summed up in one tidy little chapter. And much of the defenses of the family were missing, in my opinion. So that's why I wrote that chapter. And then I had a blank slate in front of me, and I thought, my gosh, now I should dig into the anti-family tradition and try to figure out in Western civilization why it's been so strong, so prevalent, and really has never gone away. In fact, I think we're going to feel at the end of this hour that it's just about stronger than ever in our society. Let me begin with a little quote, which I mentioned before, but I'm not sure I actually quoted Plato and his notion of the family, which he wrote in his book, The Republic. And this is a matter of great interest to me because I have a very dear friend who's a Plato scholar, and he doesn't like me saying anything against his hero, Plato. But I say to him, what do you say about this? Plato said, our men and women should be forbidden, get this, forbidden by law to live together in separate households. And all the women should be common to all the men. He meant should be held sexually in common. They could have sex with whoever they wanted at any time, anywhere. Similarly, children should be held in common, meaning they would be called the children of everyone, or no one in particular. In his case, I think he meant they would be the children of the state. And no parent should know his child or child his parent. So in his republic, everything would be done to make sure that the children didn't know who their mothers and fathers were. I mean, if that doesn't shock you, you're already too far gone for me to be of any help. That's for sure. I think it's an extraordinarily screwed up vision of the good life. And we'll talk in a moment about why a man as smart as Plato, and I'm not questioning that he was a really smart dude, why he would come to these conclusions. They are so bizarre that some Plato scholars I know tell me that he was just kidding, but I don't think he was kidding. You don't write 300-page books when you're kidding. You might write a couple of pages as a joke or something, but not a 300-page book in which the intellectual elements all tied together and were the key ones in the case of today's talk were extremely anti-family. Well, and I'm just quoting that to you from the first page of this chapter of The War Against the Family. The second quote I want to read to you was by a professor named Mary Jo Bain. She was an assistant professor of education. Get this? Education. At Wellesley College in 1990. So here, 2,500 years later, she says, in order to raise children with equality, we must take them away from their families and communally raise them. Well, that was a short way of saying exactly what Plato was saying. So here we have Plato in drag, so to speak, feeding us the same nonsense about how to raise our children. And behind comments like hers, and of course Plato's, you can't help but hear the sound of tank treads rolling and machine guns getting loaded to force you to do things their way. I mean, it's all these people really. It's almost like they think that when the Berlin Wall went down, all the Germans ran to the east, but of course we know they didn't. And I refer to these people as humanitarians of the whip, because they can't get what they want done without force. That's why I say they're humanitarians of the whip. They do have humanitarian ideas, but they're about an abstract notion of what humanity is or ought to be. And they're damn well going to force you to conform to their ideals. As I say in the book, they are humanitarians of the whip, bent on driving a human galley of suffering souls towards that perfect harbor which shimmers in the distance like a mirage. But like all mirages, the harbor vanishes. So they change course and they push more feverishly towards a new mirage. And that's why for 2,500 years and more, actually, because there were people trying to do this even before Plato in other societies. But that's why it's never ended. And I would say if this book, and I don't want to go into all the troubles I got into publishing this book, but I have to tell you, my first book was called The Trouble with Canada Still, and it made me kind of I hate to use the word, but a kind of a public figure in Canada. Hundreds of radio shows and interviews and all kinds of fan letters and TV interviews and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of support from people who fancied themselves to be conservatives, a word that requires definition. But I didn't think they were very conservative. And when I wrote The War Against the Family, they kind of dropped me in the sense that, oh man, now I was really getting into the conservative nitty-gritty of how to create and defend a pro-family society. And a lot of them revealed themselves to be not very conservative. They were more like conservative / modern liberals and libertarians. But my concern was what's going on here? What was Plato doing? What was Mary Jo Bain doing in saying that kind of outrageous thing? And how did we get to where we are today? Well, one of my favorite authors was Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to America in the 1840s, actually before the 1840s, and he published in 1840 a famous essay called Despotism in Democratic Nations. It was really drawn from his American experience, but it could have been drawn from any number of European democracies too. I'm going to read you the whole paragraph. It's a beautiful paragraph, actually. And if it doesn't make you tremble a little bit, you aren't listening. He said about the state, he said, after having thus successfully taken each member of the community in its powerful grasp and fashioned him at will, the supreme power then extends its arm over the whole community. It covers the surface of society with a network of small, complicated rules, minute and uniform, through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate to rise above the crowd. The will of man is not shattered, but it's softened, bent, and guided. Men are seldom forced by it to act, but they are constantly restrained from acting. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people, till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd. This is not 1940, when Hitler was ramping over European society with these same intentions in mind, statist intentions. This is 100 years earlier in a completely undeveloped frontier land called America, where this brilliant young Frenchman, he was quite young when he wrote this, could see all this happening. And he uttered these warnings, which I dare say are not very often read or heeded, which is too bad. At any rate, I want to move through some of the points in this chapter, and I hope I didn't plan on talking about too much here, but what we're talking about is a theoretical attack from Plato forward. Plato had the idea that form, what he called forms or ideas, which he thought existed in some kind of heaven of ideas above and beyond us, where he never said, and we don't know. But he felt they were the real world. For example, when you see a horse galloping towards you across the field, the only reason you know it's a horse is because there's a form of the horse, an ideal form of what a horse is, which is basically the definition of a horse, which everyone carries in their mind and learns to know. And you know that the horse galloping towards you is a horse because he fits that ideal definition. But that horse one is spotted, one is gray, one is brown, one is old and sick, one is young and healthy. They're all horses, but they're all defective. They're not beautiful, ideal, perfect horses, such as exist in his world of ideas. So for him, the world you're looking at with the dying horse, the sick horse, the lame horse, whatever, is a changing and decaying copy, a real world copy of the ideal horse. Well, I only mention this because it's important to keep in mind that for Plato and everyone like him, the ideal is, in anything, is superior to the real. The real is corrupting, changing, decaying, unreliable. Eventually it dies and rots, gets eaten by maggots, whatever, like us. But so for him, the unchanging, invisible world was the real, ideal, beautiful world. And he had this idea that, as I say, the ideal in anything is superior to the real in anything. So that became a kind of template for all utopian anti-family ideologues in the Western world. When Mary Jo Bain, whom I just quoted for you, was thinking about this, she had the same thought that Plato did. We can do it. We can get to an ideal world, but we have to get certain things out of the way first, such as the changing, non-ideal family structure, and create a world in which perfection can be created. So I think one of the key distinctions between that thrust in the West from Plato and the thrust of the Judeo-Christian world, with which it is in tension, is that Plato's ideal world does away with the need for individual moral agency. And the Judeo-Christian world is about many things, but one of the key things it's about, in my view, is the need and the freedom needed for individual moral agency. You could say that's the basis of Western civilization when you get to the real heart of the matter. So it's interesting that Plato's idea of the ideal really is equal to the main effect of the Greek tradition in Western society. It's an abstract intellectual tradition, which has to do with the struggles of human reason to know what is true, what is good, beautiful, and true. We get to know those through reason. Whereas I would say the Christian ideal, in contrast to that, is about the struggles of the soul to know the good and to know God and to perfect the self in the way that actually Buddha wanted us to do also. You work on yourself before you try to perfect yourself, make yourself into a good human being before you start going to work on others, And so struggles of reason and struggles of the soul are different imperia, so to speak, where humans do their work. And not only are they different, but they're in conflict. But take note of how many universities in the West today, I don't know about Europe, but where I went to university, first at McGill University in Montreal, they had a bunch of what were called Greek houses. These were fraternity and sorority houses. They weren't Judeo-Christian houses. They were Greek houses because the university is ostensibly dedicated to the flourishing of human reason and thinking and intellectual life. So nobody thought it was odd. Well, I did actually. And I actually joined one of them. I was a very lonely young student away from home long term. And they asked me to join their, what was called the Kappa Alpha fraternity. And they seemed like nice young men. And I wanted some friends, so I did. I hardly ever went back there, but they ended up pulling me into one of their Greek fraternity houses, like lots of other undergraduate students. But you have to ask yourself, how come we have Greek houses on Western university campuses when the whole Judeo-Christian civilization is like, the church is right around the corner, but it's not a church house, it's a Greek house. Well, you see, it runs deep in our society, this admiration, even worship of the idea of reason and the work of reason visible on our campuses. I must say, I think that's been in a state of real decay lately. As I mentioned to you before, I graduated from Stanford University, where the winds of freedom used to blow. They don't blow there anymore. And Stanford has become an engine of political correctness in North America, which I have been most sorry to see. At any rate, when Plato, entertaining his notion of perfection, turned his view to society, he said to himself, "There's a law of degeneration at work here. Societies are born, societies rise, and societies fall. Why is that?" In fact, the ancient Romans had a kind of a term for that. They called it anacyclosis, which had to do with the turn that societies going from one form of government to the other, from dictatorship or monarchy to aristocracy, to democracy, to despotism, to monarchy again, and all that sort of cycle, which they saw. But Plato called this the law of degeneration, and it was responsible for the fall of civilizations. And so he asked himself, how do you fight the law of degeneration? And here's just a few of the conclusions he came to. Let's call it Plato's program. He said, first of all, you have to subordinate all human will to the state, to the will of the state. Secondly, you have to abolish the right to private property because private property just breeds envy. Some people have it, some don't. And some people get rich with property and some get poor without it, and so on. So let's abolish private property, and we'll deal with that question via the state. Thirdly, and this is what we're mostly going to be talking about today, he said you have to abolish the private family. And I mentioned the reasons for that before, because families are very different. Private families are very different. Some are rich, some poor, some lazy, some hardworking, some smart, some stupid, and so on. And they raise different children. with many of those different characteristics. And we all know the good and the bad of that. But Plato just wanted to get rid of these differences entirely by, as I mentioned earlier, having children raised by the government in the same way, same values, same everything. For this, as I mentioned also earlier, all women had to be held in common. Sex would be had by all. It's interesting, by the way, I sometimes read Caesar's commentary on the wars in Gaul, the Gallic Wars it was called. And he ran across a tribe there, I forget which one, in the south of Britain then, which held wives in common. And he asked himself what they did about the children, like whose children are they? And he said the rule they had was the children would be the tribe would agree that the children were the children of the first man that pregnant woman had sex with. It didn't matter how many others she had sex with. That was just the rule of the tribe, like how they dealt with the potential family chaos coming out of a system like that. At any rate, women should also be forced to lead the same life as men in the community, right? Do the same kind of work, do this, and another point, would do the same battle duty as the men. This, by the way, is something that doesn't go away either. Women protesting that they want to, some women, that they want to fight just like the men and alongside them. I think in Roman times, there was some group of women who got into a huge protest. They wanted to fight bare-breasted alongside the men in military battle. I'm hoping they had good shields to protect themselves. But at any rate, they were feminists of the day. And I know Israel, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, has had women fighting in the front lines for a long time. I don't know if they still do. I actually heard that if they had second thoughts about that, it was because some of their enemies were so upset to think that they were fighting against women that they fought harder. And it made battles more difficult to win. At any rate, we've gone through the same thing in North America, especially the U.S. military, during the days when it had a draft and now when it doesn't. Women in the front lines and all that kind of thing is considered par for the course. And by the way, there's a chapter in the War Against the Family, which we'll get to if we keep this going, in which I discuss the bending of all the standards which had to be brought about in various countries, especially in America, to accommodate the physical weakness of women who, God bless them if they're heroic and great fighters. I mean, that's lovely. But if they actually only weigh 130 pounds or so, and they got a 200-pound buddy that they need to get off the field, that's a tough haul for a woman that size, no matter how strong she is. So anyway, we'll get to that chapter when we get to it. Marriage was forbidden by Plato. There should be no marriage. And as I say, no child rearing by parents. There would be state nurseries, and they would be raised only by the state. Plato also had a eugenics operation going. He recommended selective breeding. For this, he advocated what he called mating festivals, because he wanted to turn out only superior citizens. And so only superior citizens would be allowed to breed, and they would do so in these mating festivals. I can only imagine them. Well, they haven't got much on the average modern nightclub, I suppose, where there's a lot of riotous dancing and booze and drugs all over the place, and who knows what else. But anyway, they were called mating festivals, and it really was a eugenics operation, because why should you be raising defective children? So he also had a euthanasia program for those children. If they were born defective or became defective through illness or disease or something like that, they would be exposed on a hilltop somewhere, left to die, and all that sort of thing.
William,
Yep.
I would like to ask who inspired Plato? I mean, who were the main philosophers or people who actually inspired Plato to come to these conclusions and understanding? And was he able to apply his theoretical philosophy in Athens or Greek civilization in general?
Interesting question. I'm afraid I'm ignorant when it comes to actually where he derived the idea. I don't think it was Socratic, like his teacher was Socrates. But now that you ask, I'm going to want to find out. So maybe by next time I'll know. Where did he ever apply any of this? Not in Athens, but he was invited by another Greek, by Dionysius II, I think his name was. He was invited to write a constitution for him and to set up an ideal government. So he went there. He actually took a ship and went over there. For how long, I'm not sure. And it didn't work out very well. In fact, he got chased out of town and barely escaped with his life because I guess they figured his ideas were so screwed up that it was going to ruin them. So they chased him out. That's the only real world case I know of where he tried to apply his theories, which anybody with half a brain can see are completely unworkable because they offend every principle of human nature. But Plato was a diehard liberal in the modern sense. He didn't believe that in human nature. Human nature was just an idea. It's completely malleable. And if you put in place the right policies, you can change it at will in an ideal direction. You can see how it all fits together, what I'm saying. So anyway, that's where he went with that. I hope that answers your question.
It does. He's demonic, I must tell you. Demonic, nothing short of that.
No. And my friend gets upset with me when I tell him this because he's a wonderful teacher and has written some beautiful essays on Plato's work. But I can see he's lost in admiration of Plato's ideal, and he simply doesn't address this business of the family and the republic. And some Plato scholars are so impressed with his genius, and he wasn't a stupid man at all, that they just say he was just kidding. But I don't believe that. Now, if you want a reference to, I think, the most thoroughgoing assassination of Plato's Republic, you'll find it in a book by Karl Popper. I recommend this to your listeners. Popper, I would say, became a Plato scholar because he got so concerned about this that, I mean, the fellow obviously educated himself very deeply in the classics and wrote a book called, a 2-volume book called The Open Society and Its Enemies. So Popper was advocating the open society, not the closed society. And he saw Plato as the first social engineer of the closed society, as Plato advocated it then, and as we know it today from recent history, because people have actually tried to create these closed societies. Hitler's society was a closed society. All of Marxist communist societies, Red China today, North Korea today, Cuba today, they're all closed societies. By the way, I had a discussion about Cuba yesterday with my wife. I spent a month in Cuba when I was a young boy before it became communist. It was quite a wonderful place to visit. And there's been American embargo of trade with Cuba ever since. But I said to my wife, you know what really would have converted Cuban communism into an open society? She said, no, what? And I said, blue jeans and Coca-Cola. Lots of that kind of thing, market products. And that would have eaten away at the whole ideology and broken it down. But once you put the fences up, close off the island, don't let any of that stuff in, people hardly even know it exists. And today, of course, these authoritarian islands like Cuba and North Korea and so on are having a terrible time because of the internet and the leaking of information and consumer product stories that get to them. They see themselves as more deprived than they ever did before. Red China has been coping with this reality by kind of adapting itself to free enterprise in the Chinese way. So still a very communist one-party state, still incredibly oppressive. Like if you're a practitioner of the meditative practice called Falun Gong, of which there are now 100 million adherents in China, watch out. You're going to be hunted down and you're going to have a lot of trouble. So Karl Popper wrote that book anyway, and he exposed Plato, not only his Republic, but many of his other writings, like in The Laws, a book called The Laws, which I think is a better book than the Republic, a little more serious. But he exposed all of his ideas and he took them seriously. Now, Plato's second volume was on Hegel and Marx. So those of you who are interested in that topic, Hegel I have trouble reading. Honestly, I don't consider myself a bad reader at all, but I have really a hard time getting into his mind in the way that he wrote. It seems to me full of tautology. But then I have that problem with Plato too, where you define a term A to be a certain thing or have a certain definition, and then you define B, C, D, and E in relation to it. And as long as A is true, the rest follows. But if it's not true, it all gets undermined. And I have the trouble with their writings in that respect. At any rate, as I mentioned earlier, the Platonic world, and in a sense we're living in one right now, would do away with the need for individual moral agency. And now let me read to you briefly. And I got this, I didn't go looking in Plato for it. I found a reference in Popper's book, what I call Plato's greatest principle. Plato says that the greatest principle of all is that nobody, I mean, really, listen to this. He says nobody, whether male or female, should ever be without a leader. He should get up or move or wash or take his meals only if he has been told to do so. He should teach his soul by long habit never to dream of acting independently and to become utterly incapable of it. In this way, the life of all will be spent in total community. Well, that's like the banner statement for all Platonist experiments throughout history.
What does it say about our civilization that we regard him so highly?
I wish I knew. I may go back to my friend and ask him to please help me. Please, I want to hear you defend this. I don't want to lose a friend. That's all. Anyway, Plato's views are diametrically opposed, as I write here, to those on which our own Western society is based. He was an enemy of individual human freedom as we know it, constantly campaigned for what he thought of as a higher freedom, one dictated by the state, under which individuals would be free from the torments of social change and conflicting inherited authorities, but controlled by his unitary state. We soon shall see how all the modern ideas of the New Left and the radical feminists have their origin in Plato, with the proviso that he was smarter than them. So,
wow.
At any rate, here's another parallel quote that I think gives us a sense of how very serious this was. To appreciate the uncanny persistence of Plato's ideas in modern totalitarian states, some 2,400 years later, it is sufficient to read Article 6 of the Soviet Constitution. Now, how many people do you know who've actually read the Soviet Constitution? I haven't read the whole thing, but I read enough of it to pull this out. This is called Article 6. And it says it said in Article 6, the Communist Party, armed with Marxism-Leninism, determines the general perspective of the development of society. You hear Plato in that? And the course of the home and foreign policy of the USSR. It directs the great constructive work of the Soviet people and imparts a planned, systematic, and theoretically substantiated character to their struggle for the victory of communism. That's Article 6. Listen to the words, theoretically substantiated. That means they've worked it out according to a system of internal reasoning, which is self-referential. Each of the terms refers to every other term, and this is what I call an ideology. What's an ideology, really? Well, the first book I ever wrote was called The Critical Wager. It was a study of, you might say, literary ideologies, critical ideologies with respect to literature and the arts, because that's what I was into at the time. That was in my pre-political phase. I didn't know anything about politics or care. So I wrote the book called The Critical Wager, and out of it, I came out with this definition of an ideology. It's a system of interdependent ideas, actually a structure of interdependent ideas, which is self-referential. And that's what he got in statements like this, talking about it being theoretically substantiated. If you accept 4 or 5 of the basic terms, then the authors of these systems just work it out so each term refers to all the other ones again and again without ever really saying so. That's where, your critical intelligence steps in.
It seems like ideology exists where reality stops. It's like a dreamland where
Yes.
they can modify and change it based on whims and in whatever way they want. And I actually see a connection between Plato and other things you're describing to what you taught us earlier in the previous episode on the millenarianism.
Millenarianism.
Yes, thank you. There is a connection there, right?
I think absolutely a connection. And in fact, modern communism and National Socialism and fascism, all these systems are secular millenarian systems. In other words, the wiring is the same, but God has left the building. So, these were the features of intense religious practices when God was in the building. But once God was kicked out of the building, God died or whatever the expression is, the wiring didn't change. People still had expectations of salvation and social perfection. But instead of waiting until they died or waiting until some savior arrived from the beyond, from what the Gnostics called the pleroma, which we discussed last time, they decided, we have been abandoned. We're going to have to do it ourselves. Yippee, let's go. All we need is money, taxation, and force, the law. And we can make this happen. Now, there's going to be some resistance. People love their families. We have noticed, mothers and fathers love their children generally, and vice versa. But that's only because they were allowed to raise them and to have them in the first place. We can change all that. Let's go. So this, fired up by this dream of beauty, peace, perfection down there in the future somewhere. After they get finished trampling over all the dead bodies, people they're going to have to kill to make it happen. So this is what Norman Cohn called secular millenarianism. and what the French revolutionaries were thinking of when they marched around the Goddess of Reason in Notre Dame Cathedral. Exactly what they were thinking of. And I don't think anyone could possibly have been more disappointed, unless he was like a complete moron, than Robespierre, for example, who was the architect of the French Revolution, whose Bible was Jean-Jacques Rousseau's book, The Social Contract, which is a brilliant piece of political writing, which happens to be wrong on almost every count. But it's brilliant writing, beautifully written, actually. And Robespierre went to the guillotine holding this book against his chest. It was like holding the Bible. It was his Bible. And imagine how disappointed he was that his own revolution ended up cutting his head off. He never understood it. He actually tried to blow his brains out before they took him to the guillotine. But he missed, and he took part of his jaw off, and he went to the guillotine looking a little strange. But I'm referring to what must have been going through his mind. How did this happen? My dream of the perfect society in tatters, and now I'm dying. At any rate, there's a very fine book written on the origins of totalitarian democracy. I recommend it to your people and your listeners. The author's name will come to me in a moment. The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy. It takes you through, piece by piece, to how the theoretical basis of the French Revolution was built up. And latterly, I read a book 30 years ago by an Austrian man named Erich von Kuehnelt-Leddihn called Totalitarianism Revisited. It's a very fine book, too, very detailed, with lots of amazing notes. I love notes. It's where a lot of this real argumentation takes place. Totalitarianism Revisited. Erich von Kuehnelt-Leddihn.
And the one you mentioned earlier is by an Israeli author. His name is Talmon, J. Talmon.
That's right. Talmon. That's right. Talmon. Yeah. Some people don't like that book, but I do. I think it was a good peek behind the doors of the ideology, the system of ideas, as I think of it, interdependent ideas. They depend on each other. Once you pull out the foundational idea, the whole structure falls down. That's why the title of my first book, The Critical Wager, had a subtitle about what's called the architecture of ideology. You can think of ideologies like buildings. They have foundations, sometimes 2 or 3 foundations, but usually one main one. For example, Marxism has its whole sort of exploitation foundation and its anti-capitalist foundation. But once you pull these foundation stones out of the way, the whole building falls down. For example, I always say to people who ask me about Karl Marx's Das Kapital, which is a terribly turgid, difficult book to read. I couldn't finish it, but I read a few hundred pages, enough to get the idea. It's a terrible book, but there's nothing in it about wealth creation. I don't think Marx had any idea how to create wealth. And, the methodology of wealth creation in the West, which happens mainly through something I call the bonus system. It's just a phrase I had to pick to distinguish it from what I call the handicap system, which is used to defeat it, even in all our countries. All the socialist statist methodologies are really rooted in the foundation of a handicap system. And we can see the legislation all around us even today. It came into my business. I had a very good business going, but I sold because the government was telling me who I had to hire. So they were handicapping me that way. They were telling me how much I had to pay them. I couldn't decide myself. You got to pay them this much at least or whatever. No longer a free market situation in Canada, at least at that level. And they even told me how many women I had to hire. As it happened, I had a fitness and health business catering to very pretty well-to-do people who could join our organization. We had about 6,000 members, and a lot of the best workers that we had happened to be women. So I was ahead of the game from that point of view, being forced by the government to hire more women. But it's interesting. They didn't say to me, now you got to hire more men. You have too many women. They didn't say anything like that, you know. Mm-hmm. Anyway, there's lots of stories here about my business life. Like when I called the premier of our province over something called pay equity. I don't know if I mentioned this before. They were trying to force me to pay the cook in our kitchen, who was basically making delicious hamburgers and sandwiches and breakfast for the early birds, the guys who came early in the morning. After they exercised, they would have breakfast there and so on. And the government official walks in and he tells me he's going to force me to pay her as much as the maintenance man we had a 50,000 square foot building with lots of air conditioners and heaters and equipment and, you know, big machinery. And you had to have a gas license to deal with it and all the rest of it. You got to pay her the same as him. And I said, what are you talking about? You're going to force me to raise her pay to equal his pay? He said, yes, we've gone around your office and your building, and we've decided that her work is just as valuable as his. And I said, well, not to me it isn't, because I love her and her food. But when I advertised her job, 100 women applied for the job. There were a couple of men too, but basically there were short order chefs who lined up for that job. They were happy to get the pay I offered. And so was she. She's not complaining about it. But when I advertised for his job, you know, someone who's got to get out of bed in the dark at 30 below 0 Celsius in the winter with a 50-kilometer wind blowing and fix a heater that's broken with his pipe wrenches and ladders and equipment, I said, nobody came. So I had to bump the pay. Still nobody came. Finally, I had to bump it to where it is now, and he came. So I hired him. If I could have got someone of his talent for less, like what I was paying her, I would have. Who wouldn't? You know, nobody goes to the grocery store and buys the very cheapest of everything that they can. Sometimes, okay, but mostly they want the best bang for their buck. And that's the same when it comes for labor in a free market. But you see, what was going on there was this guy wasn't into a free market. Ideologically speaking, he was into what I call the handicap system, and he was going to penalize me because I didn't agree with his system, force me to pay her the same as him. I finally just kind of, if you make me do that, I said, a hamburger in this little cafeteria here, we're going to have to charge $15 for it. And in those days, it was like $2. I said, we're going to have to raise the price of the hamburgers to $15. Nobody will buy them, and we'll close the cafeteria, and she'll be out of a job. Is that what you want? So he didn't know what to say. So he just shook his head. So I called the premier of our province, Premier David Peterson. You know, Ontario's not a small place. Today it's about 13 million, I don't know. But he was the premier. And I happened to get him on the phone. And I said, Premier Peterson, one of your minions came by trying to force me to pay our staff more money because of this pay equity program of yours, where you want us to pay people equal pay for work of equal value, not equal pay for equal work. We already do that. You're trying to establish some kind of value to different jobs and then forcing us to adjust the pay accordingly. And he said, well, there's a wage gap between men and women. And I said, so what? I said, most women, when they get married, especially when they get pregnant, they quit their jobs or they change their jobs or they decline a promotion, which causes a wage gap. Whereas most guys who aren't even thinking about much in this respect, when they get married, suddenly the promotion they were offered last month, but which they turned down, they go back to the boss and they say, you know what? That promotion you offered me, is it still available? I'll take it. Like, they go for more money and they fight hard to get it because they're going to get married. The woman who's pregnant wants to raise her own kids. She doesn't want more work or she wants part-time work, or whatever. You're going to have a wage gap. It's not somebody voluntarily penalizing one employee over another. And then I said, by the way, do you know there's a bachelor wage gap in this province? He said, what do you mean? I said, bachelors, by and large, make about 30% less than married men do in this province. He said, really? And I said, yeah, it's all, you can get it from Statistics Canada. It's all there in the numbers. We have a bachelor's wage gap. Are you going to force us to pay bachelors more? Because they never applied for better jobs and all that sort of thing? And you know what he said to me at the end of this conversation? He said, oh, Bill, he said, it's just politics. And I was in the face of the deepest cynicism right then at that point. Billy says it's just politics.
Wow.
You see, he never thought it through. He didn't have the numbers like I did. He didn't know what to say, so he just said it's just politics. And he thought he was being real smart. At any rate, maybe I should get back and finish up here. I want to just go through a few more of these.
Thank you.
Anti-family realities, because after Plato, what you see in our society is a whole line or a whole pedigree, if you like, of what I think of as intellectual terrorists. These are people who are aiming to destroy the natural family. I'll just mention a few. For example, I think one of the biggest ones in the early 18th century was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau himself was an incredibly eloquent writer and a sharp thinker, but ideologically dumb and stupid. He also had a mistress of 33 years with whom he had 5 kids. And what did he do with his 5 children? He took them all to the local orphanage, where, as far as anyone historian is able to find out, they all died. So this was the great lover of mankind and how he dealt with his mistress. He never married her, despite her demands to marry and her shame at just being his mistress. And he took all his kids to an orphanage where they died. And I just want to read you what Rousseau said to himself. When Rousseau heartlessly gave up his own children, he persuaded himself of the correctness of this despicable act by saying, and now I'm quoting, I thought I was performing the act of a citizen and a father, and I looked on myself as a member of Plato's Republic. End of quote. That's a quote that I found in his writings to give you the lineage straight from Plato up to Rousseau, 2,200 years later. I looked on myself as a member of Plato's Republic. I'm sure he smiled when he said that. He thought he was proud of it.
It only shows that he didn't think that Plato was kidding.
No, that's right.
Like suggesting.
Yes, and even if someone were able to argue that Plato was kidding, a lot of the readers, like Rousseau, of his work, did not think he was kidding. And so the next thing Rousseau said, he said, you must therefore treat citizens as children and control their upbringing, and all their thoughts. And this led me to a line by the amazing poet T.S. Eliot. He's a poet in the Anglo-American tradition. He wrote a famous poem called The Wasteland about the degradation, really, of Western society and the loss of the deeper symbols in our culture. And he said something I thought was really pertinent. He said, we are dreaming of a system so perfect that no one will need to be good. That's a profoundly wise operation. We are dreaming of a system so perfect that no one will need to be good. In other words, a system that would remove the need to all citizens to do what a wonderful man named Irving Babbitt called the soul work required to be a good person. And anyway, there was a whole series of these people in modern times who followed this trend. H.G. Wells, for example, B.F. Skinner, famous American psychologist, who basically said, give me a child of young enough age, and I can make them into anything I want with my psychological conditioning methods.
So you're basically talking about perfecting society while removing the need for moral behavior on the part of the individual.
Yes, which is the Judeo-Christian emphasis. I mean, I realize the Greek element has been incredibly strong in our society, but it seems that these intellectuals, while you might say determining their course of their revolution by means of a secularized Judeo-Christian theology, the kingdom of heaven, bringing it down to earth rather than living as a religious person for the kingdom of heaven after this life. So you might say that both these elements are here. We have the rationalization / secularization of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which has brought us these secular millenarian movements, and of which I think, as I say, Nazism, communism, fascism, these were all secular millenarian movements. There's just no question about it in my mind.
Can you please remind me the name of the author of the book about millenarian?
Yes, Norman Cohn, C-O-H-N. Once you start reading it, you won't want to put it down. It's just a fascinating study from which I learned a lot. And if you don't mind the flagrant self-promotion, I wrote 3 chapters in my book called The Trouble with Democracy, which was a study of democracy from the ancients to the present, really. There's 3 chapters in there in which large parts of chapters in which I tried to discuss Marxist communism and Nazism from this point of view. And there's also I think a pretty strong chapter prior to those 2 sections in that book called The Longing for Perfect Democracy. And that derives a lot from Norman Cohn's book and others, leading up to how this played out in the 20th century in these secular millenarian movements, which were so damaging, so very damaging. So then in the middle of the 19th century, I'm leaping forward again, we get Marx and Engels. We get the Communist Manifesto of 1848, in which he, I'll tell you what he said. Anybody who isn't shocked by what he said or thinks he was kidding has to think again. So Engels was his collaborator in this little book. It's only about this thick. It's not a 50-page book, maybe. And I have one of the original copies from that 1848 printing. In their 1848 manifesto, Marx and Engels wrote that, quote, the bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement, which for him was the concept of private property, when its complement vanishes. And both of these things will vanish with the vanishing of capitalism. And I have in brackets after that, instead, Marx vanished. But at any rate, I can't avoid a little humor once in a while when I'm writing about such dreadful topics. But anyway, he wanted the bourgeois family to vanish. And of course, Engels wrote a book about the same time called The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. Well, at the same time, he wrote it much later, 1884. 1884 isn't that long ago. And it was like Plato, the return of Plato. His ideas fed anti-family views of egalitarian statism to most Western nations, including to Canada and Sweden in particular. Canada took a lot of its own anti-family policies from the example of Sweden, and I have a chapter in the War Against the Family on Sweden and what it did with respect to the family. But it found its spokesman, I say spokesman with a capital M instead of spokesperson. I'm still old-fashioned, I guess. Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau, the father of our current prime minister, was not a communist, but he was very much a hard left socialist. And under his, that's how I got going, writing all my political books. I could see where Canada was going. So I wrote a book called The Trouble with Canada, and then rewrote it 20 years later. But it was all spurred by these kind of Plato and drag policies and comments that Trudeau was imposing on my country, along with people that got sucked into his wake. People like Judy Rebick, very radical feminist, became the head of the National Coalition of Feminists in Canada. I forget what his actual name was. But she more or less admitted to the Globe and Mail, our major national newspaper, that she was formerly a member of the Marxist Party of Canada. And now she was not, but, you know, the thinking was all there. From Plato through Marx, through Trudeau, through her, through Swedish policymakers, who set the example for us. I remember Trudeau was walking around with our Minister of Justice of the day, saying that Sweden was the middle way, that, you know, America was vulgar and way too materialist and capitalist. So Canada wasn't going to follow that example. So that's, for example, that's why Trudeau imposed a metric system on Canada. America is our greatest trading partner. America, you know, like 85 or 90% of all our trade is with America. It's huge. And America's never gone metric and never will. And Trudeau forced a metric system on Canada, which was an artificial thing to do, because there's so much infrastructure in this country, which was built on the British system of weights and measures and lengths and all the rest of it. You'll never get rid of it. Like every telephone pole, the distance between them is measured in feet and inches and yards and all the rest of it, and wires in all the cities and sewers and Lord knows what. Nevertheless, he wanted to make a distinction between Canada and America, and the metric system would do the job. Never mind that it cost us about $100 million to change every road sign in the country and go to kilometers and from miles per hour and every car and all the rest of it, you know. But, you know, nothing stops an ideologist who's spending other people's money. You know, he never got the message from Margaret Thatcher, who talked about how, you know, socialists take great pleasure in using other people's money to realize their ideals until they run out of it. And then they really don't know what to do. At any rate, the other alternative to a vulgar America, in Trudeau's mind, was communism. He knew all about communism. He visited Russia. He was great friends with Fidel Castro right until he died. And they were like bosom buddies. And when Trudeau sat down to meet with graduate students in Canada, and they asked him what kind of country he thought was the ideal country and what he would like Canada to be and to become, he said Chinese communism, basically something like Chinese communism. And he wrote a book himself called Federalism and the French Canadians. I'm one of the only people I know who ever read it, but I did, because I wasn't going to critique him without reading his work. And in that book, he basically went through the steps on how you take a federalized nation like Canada, in which there's a division of powers between the central government and the provinces, and how you convert it into a more socialist type nation. And he did it with all sorts of tricky fiscal means to get an end run around the law and our own constitution, which he did. And that's where Canada is today. We're really what a wonderful American writer named Felix Morley described as parliamentary socialists. Canada is not a pure democracy. America is not a pure democracy. And England sure isn't, especially in the last 50 years, half century. They're all parliamentary socialist systems, in which we do have a parliamentary system that works in a sort of way, but they're centralizing socialist type policies, fortunately with no machine guns, which organize these nations coast to coast. Anyway, I don't want to overstay my welcome here, but I should mention modern feminism. Okay, in France, Simone de Beauvoir, she was Sartre's lover. He never married her. He had lots of girlfriends on the side. She put up with it. She became a radical far left, if not Marxist, certainly far left type socialist. I think it was Marxist. So was he eventually. And I'm quoting from her now. Listen to this. Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote a infamous book, some people think it's famous, I think it was infamous, called The Second Sex, which was mostly cribbing from Sartre's ideas. I happen to know a little bit about Sartre because of his being a nothingness book. But Simone de Beauvoir said, I'm quoting, "Women should not have choice in the outcomes of their lives," unquote. Because she felt if they had choice in the outcomes of their lives, they would get married. They would have children. They would want to raise their own children because they were their children, not somebody else's. And so just like Marx and Engels and Plato, she saw that as the real danger. If you let them do it, they will do it because it's natural. And so the whole point of a socialist society is to change human nature, to change what's natural. So that was her operation in Europe. And near the end of her life, with respect to Sartre, who cheated on her endlessly, I'm quoting her again, she said, "I was swindled," unquote. I was swindled. What a way for someone to end their life and all their work and to say I was swindled, as if she had no responsibility for it. And then we had a long string of, I don't know anything about other European feminists, but I'm sure there were lots of them. In North America, it was Betty Friedan, who wrote a famous book or infamous book called The Feminine Mystique. And there was Kate Millett, who wrote a book called Sexual Politics. This is all running through the 60s and the 70s. And it was the same old thing. The family is a feudal organization. It's rife with patriarchy and sexual slavery of the wife in the home. She even referred to patriarchal society as, quote, a death penalty, unquote, with respect to women. And at the time, she was thinking of death from illegal abortion, because abortion wasn't legal. It became legal in America nationally through a case called Roe versus Wade, which is right up in front of the U.S. Supreme Court now. I think it's going to get reshaped, so to speak, by the more conservative court, which came into play under Trump. But she called patriarchal society a death penalty for that reason, but it wasn't just the abortion story. It was just the idea that the life of the homemaker and the wife and mother kills off the woman's character and personality. Well, then we had a whole string, and this is when I went to graduate school at Stanford, we had a whole string of what I call credit card hippies. These are fairly wealthy kids who come from good families. I call them credit card hippies because they had daddy's credit card in their pocket and could basically buy whatever they wanted. But they unleashed a whole frontal attack on bourgeois society, as they called it, and the natural family. Then we got into, free love, lots of drugs, LSD, mushrooms. I mean, the whole thing, that's still going on. And To some extent, you'd have to say the reasoning made sense for that generation because they saw the atomic bomb. They saw the effects of World War II and the Korean War. And then, of course, the Vietnam War. Enough already. Enough, you know. We want a different world, and we want it right here and now. And we can get it with this weed and this mushrooms and this booze and whatever. And to hell with your organized, private property-based patriarchal society. So anyway, the sequence then seems to be that from ancient times to the present, we had the Platonists against property, liberty, family, the idea that man is living an illusion because it's not the ideal world that Plato wanted to bring about. And later on in European history, we had Rousseau and all the Romantic thinkers, some of whom I have mentioned, again, conceiving of mankind. Think of Rousseau's phrase, man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. That's the first line of his famous and incredibly influential book called The Social Contract, which actually was a justification of something he called the general will. Well, our own Prime Minister Trudeau used the phrase general will all the time, along with the phrase national will. But I don't think he ever knew the difference. I really don't, because I read all his books, and in the notes, you can see he doesn't know the difference. In Rousseau's time, the phrase general will referred to the will of all the people and the good of all the people. His argument was there must be one option or one choice which is for the good of all. And even if you have a vote and they don't choose it, that's because they don't know it. If they knew the good of all, they would all choose it. Everybody would, because how could you not choose what is the best for all? So this is like an invisible objective of the Rousseauistic democracy, which is to get all the people obeying the general will, which has to be there. It's an abstract concept, which is made material, turned from abstract, get it, Plato, into a material reality by the leaders of the democratic egalitarian state in France at the time. They
are the philosopher kings. Basically.
Yeah, liberty, equality, and fraternity. It took an English philosopher whose name I forget, who said, well, the first two terms will destroy the third, because if you have liberty and forced equality, which is what he meant, Rousseau never meant equality the way we meant it in the English tradition, which was simply equality before the law, not forced equality of outcomes. Those are very different things. Well, I remember the leftist, again, his name escapes me, but he joked about this. He said, I know, he said, under your system, even the rich are free to sleep under the bridges or on a park bench. It was a funny line, but he was mocking the idea that freedom means anything without equality, you see. But in the English tradition, the idea of liberty was very important. It rooted in the notion of individual liberty. In England was the first European country to have this kind of system long, 200 years before anybody on the continent. And when Voltaire went there, he was amazed by how free the English were and how anti-bureaucratic they were, whereas my English history friend, and I've mentioned this before, reminds me, even the king could not enter a private residence as late as the 18th century without the permission of the homeowner. So it was never a totalitarian country in that sense. But the idea of equality in the English tradition was simply equality before the law. It's not ideal, of course, but the idea that a prince and a pauper should pay the same penalty, for stealing a loaf of bread. You punish them both the same. This, by the way, was not the tradition in countries like France, which France has long had a system called le droit administratif, which is basically special dispensation for officers of the state who cannot be prosecuted in the same way as they would be if they were an ordinary citizen. So the droit administratif was a way of protecting public officials from being charged by other citizens for doing something that they would have been charged for. That's one of the secrets to totalitarian regimes and how they make their way in life. And anyway, Rousseau and the Romantics, man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. Of course, it was a lie. Man is not born free. We're born helpless. There's no way we're born free. We're completely dependent, helpless human beings for about 16 or 20 years of our lives. And we would just die without that dependency on parents, on whoever was raising us. But people were stirred by this lie of his, born free, as if that were true. It's not true anywhere, and it's never been true anywhere. But then, the radical feminists came along, and they loved that idea. What they were trying to do was get freedom from men, freedom from family, freedom from patriarchy, et cetera, et cetera. And that ran all through the 60s. And then it crept into all our universities. My friend Roger Kimball, who runs a wonderful magazine out of New York called The New Criterion, I recommend it. It's highly cultured publication, wrote a book called Tenured Radicals about 30 years ago, in which he was firing a warning shot along the bow that these credit card hippies, as I call them, these free lovers, these anti-family commune types, books like I'm Okay, You're Okay, et cetera, and moral values education was all in the air. There's no such thing as moral values. And in any case, even if there is, if you don't choose them for yourself, they don't apply. That sort of thinking. These were attacks upon the moral heart of Western society, which they depicted as authoritarian. I remember a friend ran on the track team with me at Stanford. He went over to Safeway grocery store one day and he stole a steak. And I said, Del, what the hell are you doing? He said, they're stealing it. I mean, they stole it from us. I'm just taking it back. I need to eat. What's wrong with taking a steak from a huge greedy corporation like that? Who were ripping us all off anyway. That was the way his mind worked. That kid became a Rhodes Scholar and went to England for a year or two on somebody else's buck with thinking like that. Anyway, lastly, perhaps I should mention the therapists and the psychoanalysts against the family. And everything I've been saying, and in this chapter, by the way, kind of astonished me when I first ran across it. And I felt it was such a sincere duty to put it all together in a few pages for readers, because it just lay scattered here and there. But now it's one chapter. Some of these therapists were people like R.D. Laing and his student David Cooper, and a libertarian psychiatrist named Thomas Zaz, S-Z-A-S-Z. I debated Zaz once on TV, and it was tough. He was a sharp dude. He probably got the better of it. But the whole argument there was, of all these people, was that mental illness is in fact and I think R.D. Laing actually said it in these words, is a rational reaction to an oppressive family structure, meaning a structure of power relations that are controlling you and so on. And he went on to argue in I read one of his books called Knots, K-N-O-T-S. It was like the knots in a rope. And the idea was that at the heart of every family, there are knots, psychiatric knots, in which all family members are involved. So you don't do therapy just with one of the kids who's having trouble. You pull the whole family in and you try to untie the knots. And I think there's some truth in that. but he made it the only truth. And he even went so far as to say that cutting the umbilical cord when the child is born is the beginning of family violence. His phrase, not mine. And craziness is something that exists in society itself. Lang went on to become a kind of Marxist. He signed something called the May Day Manifesto, which was anti-capitalist at its very heart. So you can see the kind of Plato again shining through: anti-private property, anti-family, anti-marriage. The family's part of the problem here. He even wanted to say there's no such thing as mental illness, that society itself is sick. And so psychiatry, he said, his words again, is about the politics of liberation, meaning liberation from the power of society, the power of the family. You can see the whole thrust here is towards what I call hyper-individualism, which in turn politically becomes what I call hyper-democracy. Now, hyper-individualism happens to feed into the ambitions of the managerial state, because the state has trouble managing the family, millions of different families, millions of different social organizations, but it has no trouble managing individuals. COVID is a good indicator of that. It gives you a number, it gives you a card, it gives you a yes or a no, vaccinated, not vaccinated, whatever. States can do that with anything that they want, and it's much easier for them to do it with individuals than with groups or families, and the family is the most kind of, from their point of view, diehard social organization, difficult to get rid of, even though they try and try. And so here's a terrible phrase, again from R.D. Laing. He said, our own cities, our families, our schools, and our churches are the slaughterhouses of our children. I mean, what do you make of a guy who thinks like that? You know, other than that fact that he was getting famous, appealing to a wide audience of tenured radicals, especially radical feminists who want to end marriage, end the family, and actually end the heterosexual basis of family life, which is what we're seeing around us in Canada now. Gender is being dismissed as a reality. Pronouns that you use to describe your sex are up to you. You know, all this bizarre stuff. And here's Cooper, his student. He says, quote, the initial act of violence against the average child is the mother's first kiss, unquote. And that's because the mother's kiss. We all know that. Most of us, in my view, have been fortunate enough to know the mother's kiss. I've just written my own memoir, and in the first section I describe what it was like as a very sick young boy to have my mother come into the bedroom before she went out with my dad. You know, he would stand by the doorway in his Air Force uniform, because this was during the Second World War. She would come over to my bed, and she had a fur on, and she looked beautiful, all made up for the evening, you know, gorgeous looking. She was a beautiful woman. And the perfume and the smell of her skin and her hair freshly washed, and she would lean over and kiss my cheek, kiss me goodnight, you know, on her way out. You know, I just swooned. I mean, this was the archetypal matriarch in my life. And I think that affects every child, if they're lucky, in more or less the same way. But here's this guy, Cooper, saying that was the initial act of violence. Why? Because it seduced me. It seduces the child into the family system. It makes him revere the family system, praise it, hold it close to his heart, and want it again and again. And that makes him want to get married eventually, because he wants, the guy I'm talking about, I'm sure it's true for young girls too, in the flip of it. The young man wants that archetypal female feeling, again, in his own wife. And he goes for it. I mean, I certainly did. So I really should wrap up. I've gone on a long time. 5 more minutes just to run through what I call the anti-family weapons that have come down to us, and which, as you see, have a heritage. First of all, the handicap system, which governments bring about to eliminate all privilege, because families create privilege and they hate that. I'm talking about statist organizations, not open societies. Affirmative action, which is an official form of discrimination to bring about equality between the genders in society. Pay equity programs I've already described to you, which remove the idea of merit and choice from free market options, and they remove gender from the value of work. National employment or unemployment schemes, regional disparity schemes and programs, which have one of the effects they have is to destroy the work ethic. I don't know what it's like today, but we have a province called Newfoundland, which was the biggest. I divide all the 10 provinces of Canada into makers and takers. There's only 2 maker provinces that are producing more wealth than the others. All the rest are getting subsidies from the 2 that are producing most of the wealth. And the one that used to be getting most of the wealth is called Newfoundland on our east coast. The last time I went for a trip there, I only went twice on a bicycle trip. Honestly, you go riding by the woodpile, and there'd be this young man sitting on a woodpile smoking a pipe in the middle of the day. And I said to my wife, they're on welfare, and we're paying for them. Yeah, we're 2,000 miles away, but it's our buck keeping him on the woodpile with his pipe. That's, Canada's notion of equality in the workplace. The 5th item here is redefinition of the family. I already mentioned to you how the United Nations itself tried to redefine the family in its year of the family as the smallest democracy at the heart of society. That is so screwed up. I can't even begin to describe to anybody who doesn't get it how the family's never been a democracy, and it shouldn't be and never will be. But it was their idea of pluralizing the family and removing biology from its definition to create, again, more of what I call hyper-democracy, this one-to-one relationship between each individual and the state, which goes right into our schools, sex ed programs, and so on, where teachers today, wasn't true 30 years ago, it was just starting, but teachers today, many of them are able to say to a student, you're pregnant? We'll help you get an abortion. We don't need to tell your parents. Shh, keep it quiet. I'll help you out. Or, you want birth control pills. I can arrange that. I know a doctor, whatever, Don't have to tell your parents. So this kind of thing is going on and has been for some time. Progressive taxation, I don't want to dwell on that. National debt, I think one of the greatest moral failings of the modern welfare state is its imposition of the costs of our consumption on future generations who are not here to defend themselves against our appetites. It's an absolute disgrace. And I don't know why citizens haven't risen up and shamed their governments into paying off their damn debts and, paying for their own actions. Promoting work outside the home. We already talked about Sweden and Canada and the idea of independence and so on. What the Swedes found out, by the way, and we'll get to that when we get to the Swedish chapter, is once they started promoting more economic independence and kicking all the women out of their homes and into the free market, was that they had more of a very high, what they call couple dissolution rate. They didn't talk about divorce anymore because so many of them weren't getting married in the first place. So they talk about couple dissolution. Well, that rate went sky high once they started basically shaming everybody to get out of the house and support themselves instead of relying on your husband's income and all that kind of stuff. So in a sense, they were returning Sweden to a modern version of the old factory system, where the women had to get out of the house, along with the men and the children, to go work in the mines and the factories to make enough money to buy enough food for the family. And then, of course, we have state daycare. This is not an idea that we should have daycare for the needy. And I don't mind a little bit of daycare for any child. It's good socialization. And the idea of subsidized daycare for people who are truly needy and truly can't work without it, I think it makes some sense. But the idea of state daycare as a universal right for everybody, rich and poor alike, that's an ideological program which is intended to help women get out of the patriarchal home and become independent socially and economically and stand on their own 2 feet. And that was the idea. Once you persuade them that they're dependent beings, then all these arguments start to make sense to the women who are falling for it. And really, that I'd say subsidized state daycare is the linchpin for the radical reorganization of Western civilization. And then, of course, there are anti-family laws which have come into play. Divorce, for example, no-fault divorce. In Canada today, I don't know about wherever the people listening come from, but we have a system which I call it 2 to make it, 1 to break it. So marriage is not possible in Canada anymore. You can't get married, not in the real meaning of the word, where it's 2 to make it, 2 to break it. It's a negotiation in and a negotiation out. 2 to make it, 1 to break it means any one of the two can just walk in and like a Muslim and say, I divorce thee. I want a divorce. And it's over. So marriage is gone from that point of view. And of course, there's other laws forbidding landlords to discriminate, is the word, by only renting their apartments to married couples. They can't ask for marital qualifications anymore in our country, that sort of thing. And when it comes to international weapons, I'll just leave it till we get to that chapter. But there's a whole set of international treaties which are infected with these far left, quasi-socialist. I say quasi because, as I say, there's no machine guns. In a sense, it makes it worse because you don't need machine guns. Bah, like sheep, everyone's going along with it. So you don't need machine guns. But there's all sorts of international treaties which are intruding into, let's call it, the private life of the family in the private lives of nations, which once controlled their own selves and their own citizenry and their own laws, and which are now being pressured to sign on to international treaties, which are extremely anti-family. And by the way, anti-family treaties are not really pro-child. They ostensibly give privileges to the children, which they don't have, but because children are minors, they're actually giving rights to the government, not to the children. And that's how the government becomes even more intrusive in private family life. Boy, I've gone on at too great a length tonight, but I want to thank you for
wonderful. It's wonderful. Thank you, William. Thank you very much. I would like to recommend everyone to go to his homepage. It's williamgairdner.ca. You have a variety of about 14 books, which are all highly recommended. Do you have still the patience to see if we have one quick question, or
sure?
We're going to...
Yeah, 5 minutes will be good.
Yeah, let's see. Okay, so hi, you can go ahead, please.
Thank you. Hi, William.
Hello.
Thank you for very, very interesting. I just wanted to get your opinion on the National Socialist type framework that Hitler used to bring Germany out of, financial debt. I believe it took him between 5 and 7 years to turn his country around, and I believe it was it's been proclaimed as like a miracle. But the National Socialist movement was like obviously the family unit was first, and women should be at home, but they won't be discriminated
Yes.
against if they to go out into the work. I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
Insofar as I know much about it, I should say he was enormously successful. The one thing you have to say for Hitler was he was very honest with revealing his thoughts. I've tried to read Mein Kampf. I have never got through it, but I got the picture halfway through anyway. He was very honest. He never withheld any of his opinions, just very open about it. And when he got into power democratically. I think, was it 1938? He was Time Magazine's Man of the Year because he had turned, I think it was 38 or 37. He had turned Germany around from a destitute, struggling nation into a powerhouse economy. So he was very popular in the West. Even Western liberals thought he was just terrific until he turned bad, which was because of his anti-Jewish thing, which was terrible, of course. It wasn't just anti-Jewish, by the way. He hated lots of people, and his camps had lots of non-Jews in them as well. But what I wanted to say was that he was admired by the West, as I say, until he turned bad. I looked at his 25-point political program. You just mentioned a few of the things on it, like he wanted national pensions. Well, at the time, Canada didn't have national pensions. This seemed like a radical leftist idea. Now we do. Seems ordinary. Why wouldn't you have a national pension scheme, and all that? Things like this. He had a 25-point program, and I enjoy printing it and taking the anti-Jewish stuff out of it. So it ends up as being 22 points or something like that. And I show it to my friends and I say, whose political program do you think this was? And they read it and they say, gosh, it sounds like us. And, it does. He was basically advocating everything almost all the Western democracies are doing now, which they considered radical at the time. And if you're interested, there's an American writer named Jonah Goldberg who wrote a book, I think 5 years ago, called Liberal Fascism, in which he takes you through the development of this parliamentary style socialism in America. Quite interesting, although, 30 years ago when I first wrote The War Against the Family and The Trouble with Canada, if you called someone with far left opinions a socialist or a pinko, you'd probably get a sock in the jaw. It was considered nasty, unfair, not true. But the word socialism is everywhere now in the Western democracies. It just rolls off people's lips as if it was something natural. Well, the fact is, it's not real socialism in the sense of the state owning the means of production, but it is socialism in the sense of the state increasingly controlling much of social life and organizing it for the citizens. So much so, as I have said before on the show, where people don't question it anymore, whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal in our country, which has 3 levels of government. The most common phrase you hear today is, what's the government going to do about it? When I was a young man, you'd rarely hear that phrase. People tended to organize to get things done themselves more than they do today.
Thank you, William. Any other questions, guys? If you do, please raise your hand. Yes, 1 second. Go ahead, Max.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, William. Thank you very much for your reviews. Gave us this time and explained things really well. I suppose that my knowledge is quite shallow. I might be asking the wrong question, but as far as I understand, that this left and right sort of divide, if you like, or liberal approach versus conservative approach, where conservatives say big government is the problem, whereas liberals say the rich people are the problem. But do you see some commonality in the in the way that they kind of define the enemy, where maybe there's 1% where or the very small percentage of people owning a lot of the resources on Earth, and they're actually.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last sentence.
Sorry. So the phrases like elite or the cabal or things like that, are they the real problem actually? And both sides are kind of divided, except they're not seeing the real enemy. Was that clear enough? I'm sorry, maybe I didn't articulate it very well.
You seem to be asking why one side blames the rich and the other side blames the government or the state.
Yeah, and is there actually a common enemy that we're not seeing as the general human population?
Yeah, I don't want to be tricky, but I would say the common enemy is a too loose and too easy reaching for the emotion of envy. And once that's loose in the public, and it tends to be provoked and promoted by this, I hate the word, but this kind of Marxist reorganization of society that we seem to be seeing all around us now. People use that word Marxism all the time without understanding what he was doing. But the most basic thing he was doing, and they do get this, is he was dividing human reality up into two classes, oppressors and oppressed. So no matter where you turn your eyes, you're gonna find an oppressor group or class and an oppressed class. Just walk around and ask yourself what's wrong with this and what's wrong with that, and then you just say, I wonder what the cause is. Well, there's got to be some other group causing it. It couldn't be them. It couldn't be their own fault. That sort of thing. Well, I think when you get this kind of shift in society, it doesn't matter who you point to as the enemy. I confess when it comes to having so many multi-billionaires around, the optics are bad. People don't like seeing so many billionaires because they compare them to their own life circumstances, except when it comes to their music heroes, their sports heroes, their movie heroes, like anybody from a walk of life that they love. Like they don't mind if Oprah Winfrey is worth millions and millions of dollars, and they don't mind if Wayne Gretzky, the great hockey player, is worth millions of dollars, or basketball players, or movie stars. They're fine with that. For some reason, it's just if you happen to be a corporate head and you're worth millions of dollars, let alone billions, that makes people angry, even though no one forced anyone to buy their product. So it's a bit of a mystery why they can't come to terms with great wealth in free societies, and why whenever you see great wealth, there's always more talk about how we're going to redistribute it and turn it into a more progressive tax system. I'm of the mind that the best and fairest tax system is a flat tax. I think everybody should pay tax. I'm picking the number 20%. Maybe it's 17, maybe it's 21. But some great economists at Stanford years ago came up with the notion that you could have a tax system with a flat, I think it was 17% tax on everybody. Even the bum down the street, if he's earning income, he's got to pay a little bit of tax. I don't care if it's $1, because it becomes symbolic of his gratitude for the things his society is providing for him. So, but they proved beyond a doubt that I think it was 17% flat tax would create exactly the same amount of revenue that the government in America, at least, collects today, with about 1/10 of the number of employees in the tax department, with a tax form the size of a postcard, and would generate the same revenue, and without all these loopholes. People call them loopholes. In fact, they are tax provisions, which are provided to corporations and individuals who have done X, Y, and Z. And most people don't talk about X, Y, and Z. All they hear about is the loophole. For example, if you're a corporation, I used to own a couple of companies, and one of them lost a lot of money. For 5 years, it lost money. It took me that long to turn it around. And eventually it made good money, and I sold it. But I didn't have to pay taxes for 5 years, equivalent to the amount that we had lost in those 5 years. So people looked at me and said, you got this great company making a lot of money now, and you're not paying taxes. How come? I have to explain to them that because I lost X amount of money in the years that we lost. And the government can't take money from you when you lose and when you win. That wouldn't be fair. But, most people don't understand the tax system and how that kind of thing works. So a flat tax will get rid of that. Just everybody pays 17%. So if you make $1 billion, you're going to pay 17% of your $1 billion to the government. And if you make $1,000, you're going to pay 17% of that. Everybody pays, no exceptions. Flat tax for everybody. Do it on a postcard. Get rid of these thousands and thousands of interconnected departments of the government, which are following you all over the damn place, trying to figure out how to tax you more for everything you're doing. I mean, I don't know about where you come from, but in our country, there's books this thick, which you can get, which explain the various taxes that we pay. I think what we call Tax Freedom Day in Canada is now near the beginning of, not quite the beginning of June, maybe the middle of May. So you're basically working from the government until the middle of May. And then you start working for yourself. Well, this has been going on and on and on. We had no income tax at all until 1918. It was only brought in for the war, and the promise was they would get rid of it after the war. Of course, they never got rid of it. So now you're working for the government till the middle of May. Well, in a few years, it's going to be the 1st of June, and so on. How far it'll go, who knows? But I do know that now the largest tax bill, the largest family expense of the average family in Canada is not clothing, not food, not housing, not transportation. It's taxes. It's the largest item in their budget. That wasn't the case 40 years ago.
Thank you, William. Thank you for your answer. I think I will let you go. It's really late, and you...
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much, and we will see you again after the new year, yes?
In the new year. Thank you.
Wonderful. So take good care and enjoy the holidays.
You too. Bye.
Bye for now.
Happy New Year.